One thing that we train into our dogs is steadiness, because when that hen does a flutter flight, she might only fly 10 yards away and she's squawking and flapping around, and you don't want your dog jumping in on that hen, and you also don't want your dog moving at all because those chicks are probably right under the dog. I kind of have this theory of my own. Dry years, there's fewer mosquitoes and less West Nile virus that is impacting those young chicks, and so perhaps better survival. All of the terrestrial earthworms are exotic from Europe and Asia, brought over in different soil for agriculture, horticulture, fishing bait, things like that.
Everybody, welcome back to another episode of GDIY presented by Standing Stone Supply. My guest this week is Lindsey Shartell of the Minnesota DNR. Lindsey, how you doing?
Doing great.
Yeah, so first off, just go ahead and introduce yourself, kind of tell the listeners what it is that you do and kind of what capacity you work with the DNR up in Minnesota.
Sure, yeah. So I'm the Northeast Regional Wildlife Manager with our Division of Fish and Wildlife, and I oversee wildlife habitat management across the northeast quarter of the state of Minnesota. We have about 30 staff and get to do a wide variety of really cool work.
Just wildlife habitat, that's kind of all encompassing. Do you really just deal with all wildlife, or is there kind of a specific or filtering into a certain species or habitat that you primarily focus on?
Yeah, we focus mainly on game species, but yeah, any kind of wildlife. We're always looking for diverse benefits for a wide suite of both game and non-game species. So pretty much wildlife habitat across the board.
Now, that's your professional role, but your personal role, obviously, you're on this podcast, so you have some dogs and some kind of interest in upland hunting and hunting with dogs of some sort. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself in a non-DNR fashion and tell everybody kind of the dogs that you run and really your interest into wildlife as a whole anyway.
Yeah, so actually I'm a big upland hunter. I got into hunting after I started working for Minnesota DNR, just being around a lot of other people who hunt, and kind of took it on later in life. So I got into bird dogs, and that's kind of where it all went downhill. Right now I've got 2 German short-haired pointers, and I've also got a 10-year-old Labradoodle, Murray. He's a flushing dog, and he likes to get out hunting too.
So you actually hunt with your Labradoodle then?
I do, yeah. He's a 50-50 lab poodle and big hairy guy, and he kind of just hangs with me. But if there's a bird on the trail, he is on it. And if he hears the other dog's beeper going off, if they're on point, he knows what it means. He likes to go in there and flush the bird.
Well, I definitely want to hear more about your short hair, but I think you might be the first person I've actually interviewed that actually hunts with their doodle. The doodle is kind of a tough topic in the upland hunting space, especially if you look at social media and Facebook groups. So I'm kind of interested how you landed with a Labradoodle. Where did that even come from? Did it just fall in your lap, or did you actually seek it out?
Yeah, so yeah, they get a bad rap, but so he's 10 years old, kind of before doodles became a really cool thing, and I didn't hunt at the time. I just wanted a dog for a family companion, and there was a farm litter, just a mixed breed, and ended up with this really cute looking little lab guy. And when he was probably about 10 months old, before he was even a year old, I decided I was going to learn to hunt. And so I would just go walk trails with him. And, my first rough grouse ever, we were just walking a trail and it flew across and landed in a tree. And I stood there for like 2 minutes trying to aim at it. I hadn't really had a lot of practice with a shotgun. Finally took the shot, and Murray, he just took off running away. He never did any gun intro, nothing like that back then. So he finally came back to me and he saw the grouse and thought it was cool. And ever since then, he's been a bird dog too.
Wow. So game on just from a happenstance kind of interaction and stumbling across birds. It's amazing how just a bird contact will light a fire with a dog.
Yeah, yeah.
So you get into the DNR, that kind of leads you going grouse hunting with Murray and the Labradoodle. Where did the short hair come in? Did you just kind of fall in love with it, and next thing you know, you wanted to take it a little bit more serious, or kind of talk to me about that progression from a Labradoodle to a short hair?
Yeah, so I, started off like a lot of people, just walking trails, not knowing where to go. And you'd think being a wildlife biologist, I'd have a little upper hand there, but still kind of just hit or miss trying to learn it on my own. And had a lot of coworkers with pointing dogs. And so decided I wanted to get a bird dog, and actually started off with the wire hair, German wire hair that I lost early on when she was 3. But got connected with Jerry out at Pine Ridge Grouse Camp and took my little wire hair out there and had no clue, and asked Jerry to see if she can point a bird. And we worked all summer and got her ready for bird hunting, and had a pretty successful first season with her. So that kind of sparked everything for me. And now I've got the 2 short hairs. So got 3 dogs total, and they
Mm.
keep me pretty busy.
I'm kind of surprised that you showed up on Jerry's porch with a wire hair, and then not only did he allow you to keep the wire hair, he allowed you to go the short hair route over the English route, whether that's a setter or pointer.
Yeah, there were some pointer litters that I almost took a puppy home from him, but somehow I just ended up with the German dogs.
Yeah, it's funny how that works out sometimes. So, talk to me about like the natural progression to where, like you said, you weren't really an upland hunter until Murray, and you just got out. The Labradoodle figured it out, and then next thing you know, you're full blown jumping in knee deep into the wire hair and short hair route. How long? Like, talk to me about the learning curve of figuring out rough grouse to where all of a sudden, fast forward, you're a guide out there at Pine Ridge, and I know that that's not your full-time focus or your primary focus, but you do help out from time to time when Jerry has a need for somebody else to kind of tag in, if you will. Talk to me about your natural progression as a rough grouse hunter from just going out there with Murray to now you're guiding clients.
Yeah. So once I got my wire hair Izzy, we still kind of didn't know what I was doing. And it took a lot of time just walking trails, and we'd start flushing grouse and just looking at where they came from, what kind of habitat were they in, what kind of foods were around, things like that, just putting the whole picture together. And it took a long time before I was able to get off those quick enough shots to actually harvest some grouse on the wing with her, and just kept enjoying it so much that I would go more and more often. And it's kind of that being really close to success and flushing birds, and like, I was so close this time. Next time I'm gonna get the gun up fast enough. I'm gonna get that shot off, or
Right.
I'm gonna pay a little more attention and try to get on the bird faster, get ahead of it, that kind of thing. And so it was more of that competitiveness in myself, that I wanted to be successful. And so I started going more and more, and started finding success. Was, living in northern Minnesota, we've got a lot of birds, so it's fun to go out, and we've got tons of public land. And so, starting to get more comfortable trying new places, and just going to different areas and finding birds and putting it all together, where we should be looking, what kind of habitat, what they like, different patterns that you see.
Yeah.
Kind of
I, I,
got
th- I
better and
think a,
better.
I think a lot of that kind of story, a lot of people can relate to, because it seems like you have kind of two different people that go into the grouse woods for the first time, and one, the first type of person is kind of you and myself, to where you go in and you find them, you get a little bit of a taste of it, but it's so difficult, it just makes you want to keep going, and I'm gonna figure this out, I'm gonna find success. Then you get the other people, they're like, they go in there and they say, man, this is pretty tough, this is difficult, and they kind of back out of the woods and then just go back out on the prairie. It seems like you kind of have two different perspectives of upland hunters and what people appreciate about it.
Yeah. And the other part of it, of course, was getting that perfect dog work. And, we've got so many woodcock here, and they are so good for the early first year dog and trainer, that that first year with my wire hair Izzy, I was able to shoot a limit of woodcock that were all pointed by her, and that was my goal for the season. And I think I got it done like late October, so it took the whole season to get there, but we finally made that accomplishment happen. And it just, increased my desire to get out and passion for chasing birds and different species and starting to travel more and learning other states and other birds and different habitats and things like that.
Yeah. How much do you think woodcock plays in the role of the average person coming into the grouse woods? Like, what has the woodcock meant to you over the years? You just said like starting out with a young dog, and there is a lot to be said about the woodcock and teaching a young dog, but then also you kind of find the people that more or less kind of after being in it for a while, they'll start trying to maybe even avoid areas to where woodcock are more prevalent. And do you have a kind of a thought process on, I guess, the trajectory of your dog and the work that you're trying to cultivate in them, and in any relation to woodcock contacts? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I love woodcock, and I still to this day seek them out to hunt them. And I do woodcock banding as well in the spring. And so getting the dogs out on woodcock is always important to me, and handling them well and being steady on the birds as well is important now. But starting off, it was so accessible, so easy to get into a bunch of woodcock, and like shooting was always tricky for me, like having guns that didn't fit me for so long that I just wasn't a good shot. And you get a lot of opportunities at woodcock, and you can get prepared, dogs on point, you got time to get ready. And so it really built my confidence up, I think, and probably one of the reasons I kept going at it, because you had those opportunities and I knew I could get it done and get that first limit of woodcock with my pointing dog. And so nowadays, I definitely still get on a lot of woodcock when I'm training dogs, and they're always a lot of fun.
Yeah. I think that's the element of woodcock that maybe gets overshadowed a little bit now when we kind of discuss them in relation to how dogs handle grouse. But I don't think anybody could deny the confidence building aspect of woodcock for not just young dogs but young hunters as well, just getting in there, getting used to the woods, getting used to handling a shotgun in the woods and that thick dense cover. I think that's really where the value in woodcock comes in for the average person kind of starting out. Is it sounds like you've kind of talked about your experience with the shotgun and maybe not being well versed in handling a shotgun. Was that pretty much your biggest learning curve getting into upland hunting, was figuring out the shotgun aspect? Because you're a wildlife biologist, you kind of had your foot in the door on that, so you could figure that out a little bit easier. But it sounds like maybe the shotgun was your biggest challenge. Is that correct?
Yeah, it definitely was a challenge for me. I was kind of timid around shotguns. That first year with Murray, I was kind of afraid to take a shot, and just, the safety part of it, and thinking it was just a lot at once. And so it took me some time, but, getting out, I ended up taking actually a Rough Grouse Society women's intro to wing shooting course that we did at our gun club here in Grand Rapids. And really just shooting with other women and practicing on the range built up my confidence a lot. And we did a nice pheasant hunt, and just getting more practice shooting really helped. And of course, these days I have a custom fitted upland gun company side by
Go
side.
figure.
And so
Yep.
the change over from having, just a off the rack gun compared to a gun that's fitted to me has made a huge difference in my shooting as well.
Yeah. Well, this might be a strange question, but kind of put yourself back in the shoes of Lindsey as the newbie, the beginner. Do you really think that you would have at least been more comfortable or confident if you had that fitted gun right out of the gate? Or do you kind of appreciate the fitted gun now more because you spent some time with ill-fitted guns?
I probably appreciate it more now, but I think, having something maybe that fit better might have helped, because, when we did that class, they actually took a look at our guns and told us how it was fitting and how we were shooting. And these are bunch of men telling you this stuff, but it's like, this gun doesn't fit you. And then like, okay, but not, so what should
What
I
does
do?
that mean?
But yeah, so I don't know. What you said about new hunters, it really, I have had some good experience with that as well. With woodcock in particular, my sister Rachel, I took out hunting first time, had never shot a shotgun, threw one of these, just a generic over under in her hands, and she was able to shoot her first woodcock on her first day out. Just, you know, the opportunity, I think, was a big part of it. So maybe it's not just the gun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it was just the gun, then that gives everybody the excuse, right? If I go out there and miss, it's just like every time it's the gun, it's the gun. It's kind of what I'm nervous about my new shotgun. It hasn't landed yet at the time of this recording, but I know when I get that, then I don't really have an excuse. I can't blame the shotgun anymore, so I don't know how I'm going to feel about that.
There's still plenty of excuses in the grouse woods.
The tree jumping in the way, the bird always flushing out on the wrong side of the blowdown, what have you. I want to talk about the woodcock banding because this is something that, you know, throughout the years it's been mentioned. I think a lot of my listeners are aware that it's a service that's out there. I know that the people that really kind of pay attention to the woodcock migration map, that they might be a little bit more familiar with it. But why don't you talk to me about that program and like the importance of it, kind of how it runs, and what you guys are really out there trying to figure out with these birds?
Yeah, so I've been woodcock banding for quite a few years now. Started with my wire hair Izzy, and our Minnesota woodcock banding program, which we just added Wisconsin recently, has been going for a long time now, and it's a volunteer program, all outdoor enthusiasts with pointing dogs who are volunteering their time to look for woodcock with their chicks in the spring. And so we're using the pointing dogs to locate hens and then banding the chicks and the hen if we can net it as well. But those bands, before we had satellite trackers and all the technology we have these days, that was one way we could look at migration patterns for woodcock, as well as harvest and timing of migration and different things like that, provide information for managing the species. Nowadays, you know, we've got a lot better technology, but the banding program, I think, is a really important outreach. Chicks are really cute, and they can definitely get people interested in woodcock and bird hunting, upland hunting, pointing dogs, things like that. It's also important to have trained banders for research projects. So we like to also provide our assistance for different projects. There's a couple going on in Minnesota. We're looking at chick survival and habitat use and things like that. And so having trained dogs that can get out and help with research is another big perk of having the banding program.
Mm. And so is it really kind of similar to the waterfowl banding? If you shoot a woodcock with a band, you just kind of call in a number, give the code on the band, and you guys can just log it and say, all right, this little dude went from, you know, northern Minnesota all the way, you know, to Louisiana or the coast or wherever that one ends up flying. That's really interesting, and obviously a bunch of questions I have about that is, I guess first and foremost, like, does the woodcock act any different, the hen specifically, around the nest when they have chicks, as opposed to like what you might come across in the fall? Like, are they trying to protect the nest a little bit better? Are they kind of doing that winged bird trying to lead people away from the nest? Kind of talk to me about how the hen interacts with you and the dog in the springtime as opposed to the fall.
Yeah, they're definitely different behaviors in the springtime. So when they're on the nest, they will sit really tight. They're not going to move at all. They're relying on their camouflage, and they are really difficult to see. So a lot of times when we do have a dog find a bird on a nest, they're pointing pretty close to the nest, and that hen is just hunkered down, hoping that you walk away. But once they have the chicks, once they hatch, they leave the nest immediately with the chicks. They're ready to go. And so those hens, They also hold very tight if they've got young chicks, but when you do flush them, they'll do a flutter flight and kind of that broken wing display. They'll be making a bunch of noise trying to get you to come follow them instead of where the chicks are. And so that's one thing that we train into our dogs is steadiness, because when that hen does a flutter flight, she might only fly 10 yards away and she's squawking and flapping around, and you don't want your dog jumping in on that hen, and you also don't want your dog moving at all, because those chicks are probably right under the dog and they could step on one very easily. So typically the hen has the chicks kind of surrounding her. Sometimes she's brooding them. Sometimes they're all just out eating, and usually within a few yards of the hen.
What kind of nest size are we talking about with the chicks? Is it pretty consistent, or does it kind of vary from hen to hen and year to year?
Yep. So they usually have 4 eggs in the nest. And so just a little bowl on the ground made of leaves and typically next to a tree or stump or something like that. And if they do re-nest, sometimes they'll have 3 eggs, but typically 3 to 4. And so you kind of know how many you're looking for when you do get a hen with chicks.
Around about what time of year are they starting to establish nests? I know that this is kind of different based on your region and your location. Like, I've only stumbled across one nest one time down here, and it was actually at the end of February, but obviously I'm a little further south of you. And then chicks I've come across twice now, and it's been early April, somewhere in that down here. What kind of time frame do you guys look at when it comes into birds nesting up there in Minnesota?
Yeah, so they typically are starting to be on the nest in April, because they're not really getting up to northern Minnesota till late March. And so April, they're starting to initiate that nest. And then we typically see hatching starting in early May. So I'm talking farther northern Minnesota, because further south in Minnesota, it is a little earlier even, but it's all about snow cover and weather. So a lot of hens will be sitting on their nest and a little snowstorm will come over, and hopefully they can make it through. But yeah, mid-May is kind of usually the peak. This year we did have pretty late snow cover, so we kind of peaked later in May for hatching of nests, but it tends to kind of happen all at once and it goes fast. And so they're one of the earliest nesters.
Yeah. So how familiar are you with grouse nesting as well? Obviously, you do a lot of woodcock banding. Do you kind of have the same knowledge on rough grouse? Like, would you say that they kind of mirror each other, at least on the timeline or conditions? You know, have you kind of seen any common threads between both of them and how they nest and how many, how many chicks and just the health of the brood size? Have you noticed any of that over the years?
Yeah, so rough grouse are later. They are going to be hatching more in mid-June at the earliest. And they also have many more chicks. They typically have like 14 eggs in their nests. So typically when we're out, if you're out woodcock banding still in that late June time period, you start running into grouse chicks and they just pop up all over and they're flying around. And yeah, they're you can get into some craziness with a bunch of little chicks flying all over the
Yeah.
place with rough grouse. So a little different time frame, and yeah, different strategy as far as how many offspring you try to raise between
Mm.
woodcock and grouse.
So have you been able to kind of piece together a pattern in relation to maybe the conditions or the weather and the health of the nest for maybe woodcock and grouse? Have you kind of started piecing together that puzzle, or is that even, I'm sure that that's being researched by somebody somewhere, but I didn't know if that's something that you have your hands in right now.
Not something I'm working on specifically myself, but yeah, you definitely see for woodcock that spring weather makes a big difference in timing and survival and whether they're going to be re-nesting because they lost early nests due to the weather. And then with grouse, they're waiting longer, so the weather is less of a concern, but that's still storms, and you're thinking more dry. Is it too dry? Is it too wet? That type of thing, rather than cold, snowy weather for woodcock.
Yeah. Yeah, and you went exactly where I was wanting to go in this is kind of the wet versus dry conditions. You hear all the time like this is a great spring. It's, they've had plenty of rain, so there's plenty of bugs out there. But then, in the next week it's like we've had too much rain, it's too wet. Let's take this season, because this season was just like a really bang up year for grouse, specifically in Minnesota, but it was kind of a drier year, and it seems like pattern wise, at least on my experience, when I'm talking to people throughout the country, it seems like all the areas that were kind of dry or more dry than normal this year seem to have better bird numbers. So like, what is the correct way of looking at spring or nesting conditions in relation to the bird population and the impact that it has? Because it's just, again, depending on who you ask, you want a wet or you want a dry. Like, there's really not a straight answer for it. So, can you kind of provide some clarity in that regard?
Yeah, it's definitely a complex relationship that I don't think we quite know how it's working because, like you said, you don't want it too wet because that can flood out nests if there's young birds. And it's too wet, they have a difficult time thermoregulating when they're real young. So if it's cold and wet, that's bad. But you also want some moisture so that there's good vegetation growth, so that there's lots of insects for food. Insects are really important for young chicks, that protein, so that's important. I kind of have this theory of my own, not backed by any science, that in dry years, there's fewer mosquitoes and less West Nile virus that is impacting those young chicks. And so perhaps better survival when it comes to surviving something like West Nile. So there's a
That's
lot going on there.
Again, you're headed right where I was wanting to go. It's really interesting when you talk about West Nile. It's, some people put more stock into it than others, but that's kind of the theory that I've been hearing from a lot of people that know better than me is, it's drier, so less mosquitoes. But then also, again, you have some people saying, well, chicks and birds eat mosquitoes. So, but I think when you start weighing the options of having more mosquitoes on the landscape for food, as opposed to less mosquitoes that kind of prevents disease concerns, there's enough food to kind of counteract the loss in mosquitoes as nourishment versus, the opportunity cost of maybe, bringing in more chances or a higher chance of kind of contracting a disease. I don't know if that made any sense at all.
Right. No, yeah, I've kind of thought about that. And maybe it's all about the timing of when you're getting moisture and rain. And I don't know if we really quite know what all is going on there, but it does seem like we've had a couple of dry summers and we've had really good rough grouse reproduction. So
And that you said a couple summers, and that's kind of where my working theory, for whatever that's worth, again, we're all tailgate biologists, but that's kind of where I've started leaning more towards it, is maybe it's not this year's spring and how dry or wet it is this year. It's kind of taking the aggregate between the last 2 or 3 seasons and the conditions, to where, maybe the last couple seasons have been drier, so that's even less mosquitoes through multiple years and multiple broods, to where, maybe if you have just a dry year this year but you had a really wet one last year, you may not see the impact or the results until you kind of get a couple more years in, and consistent results.
yeah, for sure. And it's also, we had our drumming counts were up, and so you've got more grouse coming into the summer than you did the year before. And so potentially some exponential growth there, just coming in with more birds and having another good year of reproduction just adds to the
Mhm.
number of birds.
Because, I mean, outside of the weather conditions and the nesting conditions, have you noticed any other changes on the landscape? Have like the amount of logging or cuts really changed in any way, shape, or form in Minnesota? I'm just trying to piece together the puzzle, because, I think it's fair to say the secret's kind of been out with how the type of season that Minnesota had this year. I've been trying to kind of piece together from afar, like, why is that? Why was it such a bang up year this year? Have you noticed any other outside factors besides spring or summer conditions?
We've have a really strong timber industry in northern Minnesota, so we've always been doing a lot of aspen management. So I think there's not a lot that has changed in that regard, but I mean, there's definitely a lot of habitat out there, and grouse, like this year, it seems like they're just about everywhere. They're not just in, the typical prime habitat, but you can go walk through any stand and you're bound to put up a rough grouse. So kind of leaning more towards the weather conditions and things like that as maybe being a driver of what's going on with grouse.
Yeah. And in regards to the conditions, again, like I think a lot of people, especially me, I can speak to this because I'm in the South, I'm in Tennessee. So when you start talking about traveling for grouse hunting or the Great Lakes states, it's kind of easy for us to kind of lump all of them into the same group, so to speak. Like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, it's kind of all the same place to a lot of us, just, the imaginary state line borders, if you will. But I think it's interesting when you start talking about weather conditions is just a couple, maybe 100 or 200 mile separation, geographically speaking, is enough to kind of sway the conditions during those pivotal nesting months and brooding months. And so, typically you don't really kind of come across to where even the same state has the same results. You'll start finding little pockets because maybe this pocket got more rain or less rain or what have you. Uh, do you got like in your role, how much do you pay attention to surrounding locations and their impact and kind of contrasting that against what you're seeing in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, that's interesting because when it comes to rough grouse, I don't really look at that because I mean they're just good everywhere in Minnesota. But when I look at other upland species though, like sharp-tailed grouse out west or quail down further south, I am looking at like, okay, where in the state got moisture? Like, what's a good area to target? And I wondered if people do that when they're coming to Minnesota, because honestly, I don't. And I hunt quite a ways around the northern part of the state, but I've never really tried to pay attention to weather to target
Yeah.
where I'm going to go rough grouse hunt.
It's funny, when I talk to people such as yourself and our buddy like, Larson and whoever else that lives up in there, like I'm asking all these questions and I kind of get the same response as you. Like I don't really pay attention to that. And I wonder if I lived up there, if I wouldn't really pay attention to it. And it's just kind of me kind of living vicariously through y'all to where there's so much information I wish I could kind of gather from afar. I think if you live in the area, to your point, like there's so much grouse everywhere. You really aren't going to sit down and really try to piece together that puzzle of, well, why are they in this 100 square mile region but not this one right over here. But that really is only going to matter to guys like me that are driving 15 to 20 miles to a specific area to try and find birds.
Yeah, and you want to maximize your potential for success. So I totally do
Right.
it when I go other places. But
Yeah. No. Well, let's get back on the dogs a little bit. You talked about the importance of steadiness for the woodcock banding specifically. I want to talk about the actual how do you go through the woodcock banding approval process? I know you actually have to get certified to actually be able to be a part of this program. Kind of talk to me about that, the timeline, how long does it take, and are there other requirements outside of just steadiness?
yeah, so we do have a woodcock banding workshop that we host annually out of Pine Ridge. And I believe we'll be hosting one in Wisconsin this year too. More info to come on that. But yeah, so there's a workshop for the banders to attend where they get to learn about the biology, habitat, targeting these birds, how to find them, like how to handle them properly, how to put the band on, how to be safe with the way you're handling birds and things like that. Bird safety, of course, is our number one priority. But so that's one side of it, and going through all the training. And then the dogs are a big part of it too. So at the workshop, we do demos on training, and then we have a test that the dog needs to pass to be certified, where they need to be steady on a pigeon that's tied to a string on a water bottle. And so essentially just doing that short flutter flight And so all the dogs are certified by one of our longstanding banders, experienced banders in that field test. And then they go out with a mentor, so someone who's a current bander, and they work their dogs in the field and kind of get the sign off that their dog is handling wild birds correctly as well and is steady on those birds. So kind of proving it in the field as well as on the training grounds. And we do a lot of training outside of the workshop at Pine Ridge, just working with people to help get their dogs steady and practicing with those tempting birds on a string where they've got to stand there and watch it happen.
Yeah, and it can be tempting, especially for a younger dog, and that's what, throughout the remainder of the year we talk about training and steadiness, so that obviously all falls part into it. Have you guys noticed a rise in the number of people interested in doing this, or does it kind of stay stable throughout the years? When somebody leaves, somebody else comes in, have you seen any kind of growing interest in doing something like this?
Yeah, I think it's, it kind of stays the same, but I feel like, people come and go and there's always more interest, and we're starting to get a lot of interest from the Wisconsin side, which is why we pursued that as well, and just getting more people involved. And it takes a lot of time. It's not easy to find these birds and these chicks. And so you've got to get out there more than, just a couple of days in the spring. It's a short window of time and you really got to put some work in. And so I think that's kind of where there's a lot of interest, but it gets filtered down to the few really dedicated people by that point who've got dogs that are really good and can find birds. It's a little bit different, I think, finding a hen with chicks for the dog than it is finding woodcock in the fall. And some dogs are just awesome at it, and other dogs just take a little bit longer to figure it out.
Right. Well, I have to imagine that the dogs are kind of operating with less scent available, because what you talked about earlier, that hen is going to be sitting primarily on that nest. They're maybe not going to be roaming around, digging around, looking for worms. I've got to assume that there's going to be a little bit less foot scent, or a smaller scent cone. And then you're talking about the spring and everything's coming to life and everything's greening up, and all that chlorophyll is coming out of the plants and everything. So the scenting conditions with more moisture in the air is going to be tougher on the dog. So you take less scent with tougher scenting conditions. I can see how that would be a lot more challenging, and I could also see how that would be a great learning opportunity for dogs as well. I know that's not the purpose of this program, but if somebody's interested in obviously helping out and doing their part and trying to cultivate this and develop this information or database, it can also be a good training opportunity if you kind of look at it in that light as well.
Yeah, so I think that we don't find a lot of hens on nests because exactly like you said, they're not moving around. If they're going to go feed, they get off the nest and they go somewhere else, fly somewhere else. They're not walking around. There's pretty much have to run within scenting of the nest.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're giving off a lot of scent when they're on that nest either. It does get a little easier when they start walking around. And that's where I think tracking dogs actually do a really good job at woodcock banding, because they come across that scent and they can start tracking because that whole brood has just been walking, because those chicks, they can't fly until they're about 2 weeks old. So all they can do is walk. And once the dog gets on that track, you can get a nice little tracking work and catch up with the hen.
So when we're talking about a woodcock banding program, I'm kind of intrigued by you. You said that you guys are branching out into Wisconsin. What is the process like if another state or somebody's in another location? What is it like to bring a woodcock banding program to their specific location? I'm assuming because it's a migratory bird, this is kind of a federally regulated program or research program. Like, talk to me, like, what level of it is in-house within Minnesota for you guys, and how much of it is with the federal management, if you will?
Right. So yeah, they are federally managed birds since they're migratory. So we do need a bird banding permit from Bird Banding Lab. And so typically that, in some cases, that is held by the state. We do have one from Minnesota DNR, and the banding program was under that permit for a long time. but we decided to go a different direction, and we now have an individual who has their own banding permit, not associated with DNR, but in partnership where we're sharing data, and the DNR is on board with the Woodcock Banding program continuing, and it's essentially led by a nonprofit group, Woodcock, Minnesota, which we kind of been pushing to get up and running again here, but mostly they just support the banding program right now. And then so that conversation with Wisconsin DNR, just to make sure that they were on board, that they're okay with us expanding the program, was something that we started with first, and then went back to the USGS Bird Banding Lab to get that approval to add Wisconsin to our permit. So the permit will list the specific state that you're allowed to band in and different methods for capture that you're allowed to use. In our case, using the pointing dogs is our approved method. So yeah, it's all federally oversight of that banding program, and they provide the bands to us, and so we're working closely with them to submit the data, and then people can submit if they do harvest a bird, submit that online through that federal websites.
Gotcha. So how familiar are you with the process of just a random state? So like if I'm thinking of this correctly, I believe like Alabama has a woodcock banding program. I'm sure that there are other states that I'm not aware of, but like with me being here in Tennessee, obviously I've already said that I've come across a nest and a hatch here throughout the years of just running the dogs. If I wanted to get one up and going in Tennessee, is that something that I could do myself, or is it really just the game agency or DNR of your state really has to kind of take up that mantle and run with it if they're interested in it?
I do think that you could do it yourself. There's a lot of individuals that hold banding permits. You've got to have a good reason and a good plan behind it, and I think having that support at least of the state agency is important too. And so yeah, I think it can kind of go either way. Just got to have a plan in place to get the proper approvals.
Well, and what kind of data does this result in? How does this help you as biologists, and how does this help your DNR outside of just how far they fly away? I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, that's cool that it flew from, in your case, Minnesota down to Louisiana." It can kind of give you the timing, but what else are y'all trying to extrapolate from the data? Are y'all trying to figure out the conditions on when they will fly or won't they fly? How often do they go south versus, going in random courses? I know woodcock are really strange, interesting creatures. And if you look at their map, a lot of them, it's kind of like they just decide at night when they're going to fly off, like, I'm just going to go in that direction. And it's like, do they really even have a heading or a purpose for going there? Or are they just flying until they find another spot they want to put down on?
Right. Yeah. So like I was saying, satellite trackers are the new thing in this, and the data that they're getting off of the trackers is crazy. Like, I don't know if you've seen some of the maps coming out of the Eastern Woodcock Migration Project, but just woodcock making big flights over water, just hanging out in different areas, moving around. So when it comes to bands, we're kind of like the old school. We're not getting as cool of data these days, but I do think there's some really interesting things that we're learning. And personally, I learn a ton from being out banding. It's really interesting to see the timing of, okay, when are they going to initiate nests? When are they hatching? How did the weather impact that? How was survival? Are we seeing a lot of 4 chick broods? Are we seeing a lot of 1 chick broods? What kind of habitat were they nesting in? What kind of habitat were the broods using? Is it different based on weather conditions and how quickly things greened up, stuff like that? So a lot of like just a really cool, more anecdotal type findings that we're seeing just by being out in the field and seeing these birds and nests and things like that. And we've been kind of talking about doing some maybe some habitat work with some of our banding data in the future, using locations of banded broods to kind of look at that brood habitat use a little more. And then we've also been partnering with Kansas State University, collecting fecal samples from the chicks and hens to look at diet. And that is a really cool study. We've seen some preliminary results, but I think it's going to be really interesting to get that full data back from that study.
Is there anything that you can kind of clue us in, or kind of give us a preview with the early results of that study, or is that something that we're just going to have to wait on?
Yeah, I'll just maybe just one thing that I think some of the preliminary data was showing was that earthworms are still a big part of the woodcock diet. I think
Imagine that.
the small sample size that I had seen some data on, they were in like 60% of the samples, but there's also a ton of other different insects that woodcock are eating, from like probably different kinds of caterpillars, spiders, like anything that they can get their mouth on, I'm pretty sure they're going to eat it. So it's been really interesting to see the variety of different insects that they're eating. And of course, earthworms are still one of the big ones.
Well, that's a natural tie, and I told you when we were coming on here. I know that this isn't an area that you focus on or really research anymore. I think you said that you even really kind of studied this topic in college, if I remember correctly. But I do want to pick your brain on earthworms, and it's really intriguing. The listeners here might be, earthworms, why are we talking about that on a hunting dog podcast? But when we're talking about the birds that we hunt with them, it's important to understand the food sources and where they're actually feeding. And with earthworms being the primary food source for woodcock, I'm assuming that study is going to kind of reflect that further on, but we'll wait and see. What is so interesting about earthworms that it warranted such in-depth study on your part years ago? And feel free to kind of fill in any random information or tidbits that you find interesting from that research, because I know from afar I could ask a million questions, but like you said, you don't really study it anymore. So I'll kind of let you steer the ship on what you recall and don't recall on this topic, at least.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I did my PhD research on exotic earthworms, which in the Great Lakes, actually, all of the terrestrial earthworms are exotic from Europe and Asia. We don't have native terrestrial earthworms here. And so
None? There's no
no,
native
no,
earthworms up there?
there's always some mixed thoughts of we might have had some before the glaciers came through, but because of that, it kind of wiped anything out, and there might be maybe one aquatic earthworm that's native still. But yeah, they're exotics. They're from primarily Europe. We've got some Asian ones now joining the mix, but brought over in different soil for agriculture, horticulture, fishing bait, things like that. And so what I was studying was looking at the spread of exotic earthworms, and we were doing research across the Great Lakes within national wildlife refuges, kind of looking at earthworm abundance and earthworm diversity in different types of forest stands. And so I was out collecting earthworms, which is kind of a fun process. We use mustard powder mixed with water, pour it on a plot into the soil, and all the earthworms will come up to the surface, and you can just pick them off. And
Really? That's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, it was a lot of fun just being out and hiking out to different plots and collecting earthworms. And just it was surprising to see, even in earthworms, they really kind of prefer more of the maple, hardwood forests, but even in like a conifer pine stand, there's still earthworms in that pine litter, which is really interesting, where you don't think they're going to be. They're pretty much everywhere right now. But
So that's really interesting when you kind of contrast that with where and when you find the birds, because they're going to go where their primary food source is. And so in years past, especially down here, we're finding more and more woodcock adjacent to the pines. And I find that interesting, to where before, when I first started this, I never even really bothered going in there. But, I guess if the worms are there, then the birds will be there. Have you noticed any kind of pattern in relation to like maybe more you find more in the oaks and maples as opposed to the pines, and I'm assuming that has to do with the pH level, or maybe just the makeup of the soil. Kind of talk to me about the actual elements that causes the worms to be there or not.
Yeah, it definitely has to do with pH of that litter material as well as the soil. Whether it's super sandy, it's going to be probably too dry for earthworms. If it's really moist and saturated, then it's going to be too wet for earthworms. So that's a big part of it too. But the night crawlers, they're kind of the big guys who do a lot of damage quickly. They really love that hardwood leaf litter and can really do some damage to those stands, pretty much eating everything that's on the ground
Really?
and really disrupting the regeneration of seedlings and native flowers and herbaceous plants, because you don't have that protective cover on the ground anymore. It's just essentially in an area that's really heavily infested. It'll be bare ground with little leaf skeletons here and there and exposed roots of trees, and you're not getting any good ground cover, which definitely not good for cover for any kind of wildlife species.
Mm. That's really interesting. I think a lot of people would just assume that worms are in the soil. That's a good indication of healthy soil, right? Like they help with nutrients. I know, especially, if you're into gardening and composting and stuff, you hear all the time about the importance of worms getting in the soil and everything. But I guess they are just a creature absorbing all the nutrients that could otherwise go to the actual plant species.
Yeah, they definitely have some negative impacts in the native forests. So
Mm.
we're encouraging people not to spread them further. It's a tricky one because there's not much we can do once they've already established themselves.
There's no way to like effectively eradicate them without probably killing everything else that you don't want to hurt, right?
Exactly. Maybe we should just stock a bunch of woodcock and let them go to town eating them.
I guess a lot of fishermen just need to go out in the woods and collect their worms. What did
Yeah,
you
there we
say?
go.
It was water with mustard? Is that what it was?
Yeah, mustard powder mixed with water is what we used, and
And
pour
you
it
just
on the
go
ground,
sprinkle,
and
pour,
yeah,
and they just rise to the
they
top.
just come up to the top. And those night crawlers, they're pretty strong. If you got if they've only come halfway out of their burrow, then they will fight back, and they are strong.
Wow, that's hilarious. I would have never imagined. And
It was
so, any
fun.
fishermen listening to this, that normally you're buying the night crawlers at the little bait shop on the way to fishing, maybe just keep some mustard powder in your truck and go collect it. You're doing a service to the environment as well as saving a little bit of a few bucks on your bait, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And then throw them in the trash, and instead of in the on the lake shore, or
Yeah.
keep them out of the woods.
Yeah. Well, Lindsey, I appreciate you kind of spending some time with us. I know it's still hunting season up your way. This is early December when we're recording this. Do you have any plans to close out the season in any particular way? Are you getting out, this week? Kind of walk me through what the remainder of the season looks like for you.
Yeah, we actually have a kind of a unique winter going on here in northern Minnesota. We don't have a lot of snow. We've got maybe just a dusting last night, but it makes it really easy to get out rough grouse hunting still. So I'm planning to get out later this week, definitely this weekend, and try to chase some more rough grouse. There's a lot of birds out there still, and this time of year it just seems it's a lot of fun because they group up again, and so you can get into some multi-bird flushes and follow tracks around in the snow too, which is fun. So I'm looking forward to having a long season this year, just mostly just to get the dogs out and enjoy it with them. So
Yeah.
that's my plan for December.
Yeah, sounds great. I look forward to one day I'm going to experience rough grouse late season hunting up north, and in the snow. I've always said that just being able to hunt and you see the tracks, and then maybe even a snow roosted bird. That's kind of a bucket list or a dream of mine to witness a busting or a flushing snow roosted bird. But you talk to everybody that lives up there again in your neck of the woods, you guys are kind of like, snow. It's here every year. I wish it would stay off and not ruin my hunting season. But I guess there's an element of the unknown still, at least on my end with it.
No, we definitely want snow because right now, I mean, it's December. We've got pretty mild temps. We're doing okay. But once it gets into those cold months, we need a good amount of snow for the grouse to roost in. So that's how they survive those cold temps. And so we like lots of nice fluffy snow once the season ends. So
Yeah.
hoping for that this winter too.
Awesome. Well, you'll have to let me know how the rest of your season goes. Again, I appreciate you kind of spending some time and talking woodcock banding and earthworms and having some fun this morning. And yeah, just keep me updated on how the season turns out. And I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great talking with you.
All right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Lindsey Shartell. This was presented by Standing Stone Supply, DT Systems, Onyx Hunt, Final Rise, and Upland Gun Company. Woodcock banding, it's something that if I lived in a state that was an actual program already, I can say that I would definitely already be involved and certified to do that. It's something I've kind of kicked around doing anyway, even though I don't live in a state with that program currently. But it's just thinking on it. Obviously, I haven't been a part of it personally myself, but just thinking on it, it's a neat kind of springtime activity that could get you out with your dog and get more wild bird contacts while also helping provide more information. Woodcock are they're just kind of goofy birds. You always hear, woodcock will be where woodcock will be. They're kind of random. If you've ever looked at the migration map, it's very interesting, kind of following along with certain birds and their paths and travel, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of particular pattern. And anything that we can kind of help provide more information to figure out a species like woodcock out, I think that's a net plus. It's interesting, here on my own property. Usually, I can go out back and get a handful of contacts whenever I want when the migration is moving and down. And this year, in years past, I've gotten upwards of 100 flushes per season, just kind of walking around and doing training runs on them. I don't really shoot them or hunt them. I just kind of use them to just get some fun with the dogs on some conditioning runs. But this year, I've yet to come across any. It's kind of interesting. And then talking to other people, the flights and certain spots that we're kind of accustomed to over the past handful of years, they haven't produced yet. And I don't know if the birds have necessarily moved down, but I was checking the map earlier today, and it doesn't look like there's really just any that have made their way down, at least not the ones that they've had trackers on. But I haven't really spent that much time looking for them. I haven't come across them on my property, which is usually not the case, but who knows? There's a lot of missing context there. The habitat could just be aging out. Looking at it doesn't seem to be the case, but it could be. But yeah, it's something different. It's something fun, and you're having fun, and you can give something back to the community and help the scientists and foresters and all that kind of piece together the puzzle. So take that for what it is. While I haven't been able to find woodcock here, I did get out yesterday and attempt to find some bobwhite quail here in Tennessee, which is not the easiest thing. I can honestly say at this point, I'm probably a little bit more confident in finding the rough grouse here in Tennessee. I know we kind of call it the unicorn, but if you kind of know the general areas, yeah, I mean, you're not going to come across a whole bunch of them, but I have a little bit more confidence in finding them while out hunting than bobwhite quail in Tennessee, at least on property that you're legally allowed to hunt. I know where some are on public land and WMAs that you aren't allowed to hunt, but of course, it's trying to find them on the properties that you can hunt, and it's tough. We didn't see a thing. We weren't out there forever, but just a quick afternoon walk, and habitat cover looked pretty decent, but just no birds. So it is what it is. Hopefully everybody else is kind of still getting out if you can. I mean, I know some seasons are already kind of wrapping up depending on where you're at and what you prefer to chase. But still a few more months on the calendar for me to get out and chase some birds. I'm going to be on the road and get a couple quick hunts in South Carolina and Georgia here soon. So hopefully we get into some birds on the travel and everything. But It just is what it is. So anyway, again, hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, if you're listening to this and you haven't checked us out on YouTube, then by all means, please go do so. Click the link in the show notes or just type in Gundog It yourself on YouTube. And these podcasts are coming with a video component. And every week I'm trying to kind of improve the quality and how it's presented. So any feedback is always welcome. Appreciate everybody for hitting download and play. And we'll check back here soon with another episode. Thanks.